What if the greatest linguistic mystery in human history could be explained by science, yet still reveal God's divine intervention? The Tower of Babel stands as one of humanity's most intriguing stories, a moment when all languages scattered across the earth. But does modern linguistics challenge this biblical account, or does it actually confirm God's supernatural design? At the very foundation of creation, God spoke the universe into existence. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. This wasn't just a poetic expression. It was the establishment of language as the fundamental force of creation itself. When we examine the Tower of Babel through this lens, we see that God didn't just create confusion. He created the very framework for human communication. Modern linguistics tells us that all languages share common structural principles, what Noam Chomsky called universal grammar. Every human child, regardless of culture, learns language following the same developmental patterns. This isn't coincidence. It's divine architecture. Just as God embedded mathematical constants into physics, He embedded linguistic constants into human consciousness. The Tower of Babel wasn't the birth of language diversity. It was the activation of a pre-programmed linguistic system. God had already designed the human brain with the capacity for infinite linguistic variation. The confusion at Babel was simply the divine switch being flipped, releasing the full spectrum of His linguistic creation. Consider this. Even today, when isolated communities are discovered, they don't speak in grunts or simple sounds. They have complete, complex languages with intricate grammar systems. This supports the biblical account that language complexity was built into humanity from the beginning, waiting for the right moment to manifest. The science of language acquisition reveals something miraculous. Children learn languages effortlessly, following rules they've never been taught. This language instinct points to a divine programmer who embedded these capabilities deep within human DNA. The Tower of Babel was simply God's way of revealing the full extent of His linguistic masterpiece. The Bible provides us with fascinating examples of how God uses language as a divine tool. When the Holy Spirit descended at Pentecost, the apostles spoke in languages they had never learned, a direct reversal of Babel's confusion. This wasn't just a miracle. It was God demonstrating His mastery over the linguistic systems He created. Science offers explanations for rapid language acquisition through intensive immersion and neuroplasticity. The brain can rewire itself to accommodate new languages, especially under extraordinary circumstances. But at Pentecost, this natural capacity was supernaturally accelerated. God used the very mechanisms He designed to create an instant miracle. The story of Babel itself shows God's intimate knowledge of human psychology and sociology. Linguists know that language shapes thought. Different languages literally create different ways of perceiving reality. By diversifying languages, God didn't just separate people geographically. He created diverse cognitive frameworks that would lead to rich cultural development. Archaeological evidence supports the biblical timeline. Ancient civilizations show sudden linguistic divergence around the same historical period described in Genesis. The Sumerian, Egyptian, and other early language families appear simultaneously in the archaeological record, as if emerging from a common source that was suddenly fractured. Even the name Babel itself is linguistically significant. It means confusion in Hebrew, but it also connects to the Babylonian Babalu, meaning gate of God. This dual meaning suggests that what appeared as confusion to humans was actually a gateway to God's greater plan for linguistic diversity. The biblical account perfectly aligns with what we know about how languages naturally drift and change, but compressed into a divine moment rather than gradual evolution. Language evolution follows predictable patterns that linguists have mapped extensively. Sounds shift according to regular rules. Grammar structures follow logical progressions, and vocabulary changes respond to cultural needs. These aren't random processes. They're the natural laws that govern linguistic development, laws that were established by the same God who created physics and chemistry. The Tower of Babel demonstrates God working through these very laws he established. Rather than creating arbitrary chaos, God activated the natural linguistic mechanisms that would cause rapid differentiation. It's like a master engineer who builds a complex machine and then activates different programs within it. Consider how languages naturally isolate and diverge when populations separate. Geographic barriers, social boundaries, and cultural differences all contribute to linguistic change. At Babel, God used these same principles but accelerated them through divine intervention. The scattering wasn't just physical. It was linguistic, social, and psychological all at once. The science of historical linguistics reveals that all languages change over time through systematic processes. Proto-languages split into language families following predictable patterns. What happened at Babel was this same natural process occurring instantaneously through divine power. God didn't violate his natural laws. He utilized them at supernatural speed. Modern research in neurolinguistics shows that the brain is incredibly adaptable when it comes to language processing. Bilingual individuals actually have different neural pathways than monolinguals. God designed the human brain with this flexibility, knowing that his plan for humanity would require linguistic diversity. The beauty of God's design is that linguistic diversity does not create inferior or superior languages. All languages are equally complex and capable of expressing the full range of human thought and emotion. Let's focus specifically on the linguistic evidence surrounding the Tower of Babel. Historical linguists have identified what they call language families, groups of languages that descended from common ancestors. Remarkably, these major language families appear to have diverged approximately 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, aligning closely with biblical chronology for the Babel event. The Indo-European language family, which includes most European and many Asian languages, shows evidence of rapid expansion from a central point in the ancient Near East. The Semitic family, including Hebrew and Arabic, similarly radiates from the same general region. This isn't coincidence. It's the linguistic fingerprint of Babel. What's fascinating is that despite thousands of years of separation, related languages still retain core vocabulary and structural similarities. The word for mother sounds remarkably similar across dozens of languages separated by continents. This suggests a common origin point where all these languages were once unified, exactly what the Babel account describes. Scientific analysis of language divergence rates indicates that the major language families separated far more rapidly than normal evolutionary processes would predict. Standard linguistic change occurs gradually over millennia, but the pattern we see suggests a sudden, dramatic separation event. This accelerated divergence is precisely what we would expect from the divine intervention described in Genesis. Even more intriguingly, the geographic distribution of language families radiates outward from the ancient Near East in patterns that match the biblical account of post-Babel migration. Groups carrying related languages spread in directions that correspond to the table of nations described in Genesis 10. The Tower of Babel wasn't just a moment of confusion. It was the moment when God's pre-designed linguistic blueprint was fully activated across humanity. Today's globalized world presents us with new linguistic phenomena that echo the Babel principle. The rise of English as a global lingua franca, the development of artificial languages, and the preservation efforts for endangered languages all reflect God's continued sovereignty over human communication. The Internet has created what some call a digital Babel, a space where all the world's languages interact simultaneously. Machine translation technology attempts to bridge linguistic barriers, yet it often fails to capture the deeper cultural and spiritual meanings embedded in human language. This limitation reveals that language is more than mere information transfer. It is a divinely designed system that carries the essence of human culture and thought. Interestingly, modern attempts to create unified global communication often fail or fragment into dialects. Esperanto, designed to be a universal language, has splintered into various forms. Programming languages, despite being artificially constructed, develop different dialects and versions. This pattern suggests that linguistic diversity isn't a bug in the human system. It is a feature installed by God. The preservation of endangered languages has become a scientific and cultural priority. Linguists recognize that each language represents a unique way of understanding reality. When a language dies, an entire cognitive framework disappears. This validates the biblical principle that linguistic diversity is valuable and reflects God's intention for human cultural richness. Even in our technologically advanced age, the fundamental patterns established at Babel continue to govern human communication. Languages still change, still diverge, and still carry the deep cultural DNA that makes each people group unique. God's original design remains active and relevant. The New Testament promise of ultimate reunion, where every tribe and tongue will worship together, suggests that Babel's separation was never meant to be permanent, but rather a necessary stage in God's greater plan. As we conclude our exploration of the Tower of Babel through both biblical and scientific lenses, we encounter the ultimate limitation of human understanding. Science can describe the mechanisms of language change, map the patterns of linguistic evolution, and trace the historical connections between language families. But science cannot fully explain the why behind the profound cognitive leap that created human language in the first place. The transition from animal communication to human language represents one of the greatest mysteries in evolutionary biology. No other species possesses the infinite creative capacity of human language, the ability to express entirely new thoughts using recursive grammatical structures. This language instinct appears to be uniquely human, suggesting divine origin rather than natural development. Even our most sophisticated linguistic theories ultimately rest on assumptions about human nature that science cannot prove. Why do children acquire language so effortlessly? Why do all languages share fundamental structural similarities despite evolving in isolation? Why does linguistic diversity emerge so naturally from human communities? These questions point beyond material explanations to spiritual realities. The Tower of Babel reminds us that human attempts to reach heaven through our own achievements will always fall short. Language itself, our greatest tool for communication and cultural development, remains subject to divine sovereignty. We can study its patterns, but we cannot fully control its development or eliminate its capacity for misunderstanding and division. God's wisdom in creating linguistic diversity reveals his understanding of human nature at levels we're still discovering. Different languages don't just represent different ways of speaking, they represent different ways of thinking, different approaches to problem solving, and different perspectives on reality itself. The ultimate mystery remains: how does infinite divine wisdom intersect with finite human understanding? The Tower of Babel stands as a permanent reminder that our knowledge, no matter how sophisticated, operates within boundaries established by our Creator. The Tower of Babel challenges us to hold both scientific inquiry and biblical faith in creative tension. Perhaps the real question isn't whether linguistics explains away the Babel miracle, but whether the miracle reveals the deeper purpose behind the linguistic diversity we see today. In God's economy, confusion becomes clarity, separation becomes preparation, and human limitation reveals divine sovereignty.